Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for having me. My name is Johana Suarez. I'm an anchor reporter for Noticias Telemundo, Telemundo Network. And I'm delighted to be here with you. And it's so nice, I have to say it, to see such a diverse group. An applause for that. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. I want to welcome you to this panel on how to engage in community conversations about race in a manner that is where everybody feels seen, heard, and respected. We have a wonderful panel today. A round of applause for them, please. And today we're joined by Monica Haslip. She is the founder and executive director of Little Black Pearl, a nonprofit organization that aims to transform the lives of youth and their families through arts, culture, and entrepreneurship. Monica is also a racial healing practitioner and trainer.
Thank you.
Also with us today is Rabbi Jonah Pesner, one of the most influential rabbis in America. Rabbi Jonah Pesner is the director of the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism, where he encourages the Jewish community to reach across the lines of race, class, faith, for social justice. I would also like to welcome Reggie LaGrand. Reggie is the director of leadership programs with the Kellogg Foundation, and he's also a racial healing practitioner. Welcome, Reggie. And last but not least, I would like to welcome Vicky Stott, also from the Kellogg Foundation, who is a senior program officer. She leads the foundation's racial equity and community engagement team. Thank you. Now, before we start with the conversation, I know that the Kellogg Foundation has a particular way to open the space to make it safe for conversations about race. So, Reggie, please take it away.
First of all, thank you for being here. This is nice, like she said, a very diverse group, a large group, so thank you for being here. But we do, at the foundation, we start conversations like this a couple of different ways. And one way I'd like to engage you in, if you're open to it, is just basically taking a step back and breathing. And if you're comfortable with it, just take a moment, close your eyes if you're comfortable with it. Take a few breaths. Take a breath in. Take a breath out. This is an opportunity to just ground ourselves. So often, we move very fast, we think quickly, and we don't take a moment to just kind of transition into a conversation and transition out. We're on autopilot. And so as you're breathing, I'd like for you to just take a moment and pay attention to your breath. Is it fast? Is it slow? Notice what you're feeling in your body. Some of you might be feeling just after lunch a little tired. But you might also have been spending lunchtime trying to catch up on email. I'd like to offer you the opportunity to just step aside for a moment, name or note something that's calling your attention, and set it aside for a moment so you can just be present in this conversation with us today. Take another breath in. And as you release your breath and open your eyes, you too glance around the room and see the presence that's here. And as you're present for this conversation with us this afternoon, there may be moments in time that something comes to mind for you that doesn't quite sit right. And normally when we open conversations like this, we would have a set of general group agreements. Because we're kind of in a condensed time, I'm going to offer you one. And sometimes when things get challenging or might be difficult, I would offer you to turn to wonder. Turn to wonder and say, I wonder what brought Jocelyn to this moment. I wonder why Area has that thought, or why Monica shared that perspective. What's going on within me that's maybe triggering something or making me think I have a reaction to that? And sit with it. And that's the moment to just kind of be present with your emotions and your feelings as we transition to these conversations. Because as we know, racial conversations, racial healing, it's a journey and can oftentimes be challenging. But as I turn it back over to John, I just want to thank you for participating and ask you to take another breath and thank you for being here.
Reggie, thank you for that. So insightful. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
So let's take it away. Why are we here? Why are we talking about this? The impacts of systemic racism are felt today, individually and collectively. Reggie, I want to start with you. Can you give us some examples and why this matters to us all?
I think as we look at the current context that we all live in, we can point to a number of different things that cause our attention, that we can sit back and say, there's some opportunity here for us to have conversation around equity. We look at politics, we look at poverty, we look at education. There's so many different things we could call our attention. But for us at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, one of those areas that we focus on a lot is children. Our CEO president, when she took over as president of the organization, said, it's not about me, it's not about you, it's about the children. And as we think about children and we look at what's going on currently in the world, sometimes it makes it hard to just watch the news. And it's somewhere in that gap between what we see on TV and what we're hoping to talk with you about today, where we can have conversations around hope. We can have conversations around racial equity. You know, one of the things that I often talk about is a quote from the Maasai tribe. And what they talk about is Ska-xjeing-ga. And it's a quote that says, are the children well? In the village, they say that to each other, are the children well? And the response would be Ska-xjeing-ga, the children are all well. And I gotta be honest, I think sometimes, often, for quite a while, I have a hard time saying all the children are well. And I think that's something that we all have in common here. In one way, shape, form, or the other, whether we have kids, whether you teach kids, however you connect with children and families, we all care about children and their well-being and their future. And so as I think about the importance of these conversations, that's the space that I come from personally, from my experience in juvenile justice, education, health, but I think, and our foundation. But I think it's something we all care about, the future of our children. So I would lead with that in terms of what I think is one of the most important things for us to spend some time talking about.
And Reggie, before we start talking about some of those strategies that we can implement at home, I want to go with you, Monica, and ask you about what is racial healing and why is it at the heart of racial equity?
Racial healing is an opportunity for us to bring people together, to share their authentic stories, and to have the opportunity to deeply listen to one another so we can find our common humanity. And what's important to that and how that relates to racial equity is that, you know, as we deepen relationships, we provide an opportunity for people to make different decisions. So racial equity is the work, and racial healing anchors that work. It provides opportunities for people to build relationships, deepen relationships. So when we start to do the work of transformation and systems change, you know, that's heavy lifting and that's heavy work. And so it requires that we have invested the time in building and strengthening relationships. So when we get to those difficult moments, we can actually rely on the trust that we've built with each other. And that's just something that we really haven't been invited to do in this country or in general. Relationship building, most of what has happened in the past has been about separation and keeping us separated. Racial healing is an opportunity for us to intentionally build relationships so that we can do the work that's necessary for us to affect change.
And at the WK Foundation, you're guided by the framework of truth, racial healing, and transformation. Why is it so important to start with truth, to acknowledge past wrongs, and also to acknowledge within ourselves our unconscious and conscious biases?
I appreciate that question so much. And I just want to mention, if there's anyone that would like a seat, there are 4 chairs here in the front, in case you would not like to sit on the floor for too long. I think before jumping into that question, I just wanted to briefly reintroduce myself because there are a few Indigenous relatives here in the room. So my Ho-Chunk name is Ska-xjeing-ga, and that translates to white fawn in the English language. I'm from the Hunch Bear clan, and just want to thank our Indigenous relatives for being in this space with us today as well. So part of our work at the foundation is connected to a large initiative that we launched several years ago, framed as the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation effort. And so this is work that was very similar to the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that have taken place and have been led by communities across different countries when they've reckoned with their histories of colonization, of systemic human rights abuses. And so we saw those models across different countries, and we saw the necessity of one of the most important lessons learned from TRC processes was that there was a missing component of healing work that was absolutely necessary for anyone engaging in a TRC process. And so we looked at and partnered with more than 100 different organizations across the US and globally and asked questions around, if we were to bring a similar sort of TRC process to the United States, what might that actually look like? And so that TRC process, through advice and guidance from hundreds of individuals to the Kellogg Foundation, was to create the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation framework. And that framework allowed us to partner with 14 different communities across the United States to embark upon their own sort of reckoning and truth-telling about the impact of systemic racism within their communities and across communities within their locations. And so it's been an extensive endeavor across many, many years that we've been immersed in this work. And we have found that to do racial equity work from this Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation effort, that what has sustained the work over time was literally the importance of relationship development and relationship building. It was the strength of relationships across networks and communities, across racial groups, across ethnic identities, religious faiths, spiritual backgrounds, experience, the business sector, philanthropy, et cetera, et cetera. It was the relationships that has sustained that work, that healing work, that created the necessary environment for movement building and for community development. And so that's why at the foundation, we couple racial equity and racial healing work together, because we feel that those are two sides of the same coin. They're both needed for one another. When we talk about the impact of systemic racism, we unearth so much of the truth that has been hidden and is always beneath the surface, but we rarely talk about it in this country, about its ongoing impact. I also say that colonization in this country has not ended. It simply became federal and state policy. And so that impact over time, as we talk about systemic racism and the impact across our communities, healing work is integral towards us moving forward as a country. Healing work is not new. It has taken many forms and manifestations over decades. We can see some of the most recent impacts of that result, even if we look at the civil rights movement and movements across communities of color from the 60s and 70s. Healing work was integral to sustaining that work over time. Healing work led to policy change. In a sense, that's why at the Kellogg Foundation especially, we continue to focus on racial equity and racial healing, because we know it works. We have seen it work, and we know that it's one facet that is going to help this country reckon with its past and its current status with the impact of systemic racism and what we can do to address it.
And on an individual level, how do we examine those conscious, Rabbi Pesner, conscious and unconscious biases? And when we're having those conversations, those discussions on privilege, how should we approach them in a way that doesn't alienate anybody? How do we do that?
Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard. First, I just have to ground myself too in my own tradition and invoke these words, Zehayom asa Adonai nagila v'nismecha bo, which is taken from the scripture. It means this is a day that the Holy One, the Creator, has given us. Let us rejoice and be glad. And I invoke those words because looking around this beautiful multiracial evidence of, from my tradition, I don't mean to impose my spirituality on you, but the evidence of God's majesty and the diversity of creation. I'm rooted in this rabbinic teaching that says when God created the first human, taking all of the clay from the land to make the person and breathe life into them, God used black soil and white sand and yellow loam and red clay in order that the first human would reflect the multiracial reality that we live in. And note, the ancient rabbis were not colorblind. They acknowledged God created us beautifully differently. And so part of the reckoning of implicit bias and the self-awareness is to recognize that we're all created as vessels of something bigger than ourselves, and that we can only understand both our own identities and our own experiences, both of joy and love, but our experiences of oppression and of suffering, if we open ourselves both to our own real experiences through the healing process, where we surface our own stories. And then the theme you've heard so far is relationships. So, deep breath when we confront our own racism and the ways in which we've been complicit with oppression. Deep breath. It's partly about being open to the way in which we have inadvertently created harm for other people. And the only way we can know that is by listening and by learning and remembering the other human on the other side of the conversation is created in God's image, just as you're created in God's image. So when I say it's difficult, and I say deep breath, if we start with, well, that's racist, white people might get upset. And if we invite people into conversation, self-reflection, and an invitation to do what Monica so beautifully said, to first begin grounding ourselves in our own experiences of oppression, our own experiences of injustice, and then to be open to listen to the ways in which other people have experienced us, then we begin to become aware of the ways in which our behaviors, which are not because we're bad people, they're behaviors that are shaped by the policies, by the culture, by what we see on TV, by what we experience in our childhood. They all inform the things that we then do. And we can only interrogate that and dismantle it if we're actually open to doing that. I also want to acknowledge, Vicky, when you lifted up the way in which segregation has been perpetuated by policy, there was a gasp in the room. I just want to notice that gasp and invite us to think a little bit more about what's happening for people and thinking about the reality that we're actually living in right now.
The change we want to see outside, we have to start within. I want to share with you something. In the Hispanic community, we have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of discrimination within our community. And I want to ask you, at home, when we have those tias, those abuelitas that say those racial insensitive expressions, or that reinforce that narrative, those stereotypes, and then our children are there and are absorbing all this, how do we go about approaching those conversations, Rabbi Pesner?
You know, let me speak for a second as a Jewish person. I hear this from white Jewish people, and I should acknowledge, by the way, the Jewish community is very diverse. 15% of Jews are not white. We have black Jews and brown Jews and Asian Jews and Latino Jews and Mizrahi Jews and Jews of all hues. But for white Jews, okay? Yes, Jews of all hues. And I often hear from my white Jewish family, well, we're not white, we're Jewish. We're not white, we're Jewish. Now, what do they mean by that? So my grandma Fanny, who came to this country with nothing when she was 16, was escaping the violent pogroms of Europe. And as I said in the earlier panel, just this weekend, there was some kind of attack or protest by Nazis on a synagogue in Macon, Georgia. Now, these are people who are anti-gay, they're white supremacists, they're racist, right? So those white Jews of Macon, Georgia don't feel any safer than any other oppressed minority. And yet, white Jews have flourished in America because of our whiteness. And we can hold that tension. So part of the hard work around the table, whether you're a Latinx family or you're an Asian American family, and by the way, now families are a little bit of everything.
Yes.
Right? Don't we have families that are like, you know, a little bit of this, a little bit of that? Right? That's the reality of the beautiful multiracial America. But be that as it may, to actually have those open conversations and say, okay, let's have honest talk about the ways in which we have benefited from the systems of oppression and the parts of us, like for me, my maleness, my whiteness, my privileges have given me great, though I could be the target of an anti-Semitic attack tomorrow, that doesn't mean that I haven't benefited from my privilege. Those are the kind of honest conversations that we have to have with one another.
And within our families, Monica, if you could give us some strategies to talk to our children about race, because we teach them to be colorblind, to not be racist, but we don't want them to get too much into it because we don't want them to get in trouble. It's very hard. So what strategies can you give us to talk to our children about it?
You know, I always, even in my work as a racial healing practitioner, I believe when we lead with love, everything is possible. Every conversation can happen. Every conversation can open up. So even with those grandmothers and aunties and folk who say things that make us feel a bit uncomfortable, the way we begin to have conversations with them, because we honor them as our elders, is to lead with love, is to make sure that when we have these discussions, we're having them in a way that we are honoring the people that we are addressing. If it's young people are some of the most brightest and most brilliant people on this earth. And so approaching them with the understanding that they have something to offer and that they are already beautifully and wonderfully created. And so we can receive some positive and some information from them as well. It's not always about us imparting knowledge to them. It's about our openness to seeing them as human beings. And so I think this notion of, how we view the power of love. What I love about the racial healing work is it gave me permission to always be in a space of love. And so even when I go and hold circle, the thing that I prepare myself to do is to be present and to also be in love even when I don't understand and even when I don't agree, because I do believe we can hold both things at the same time. And so in our homes, when we talk about hard conversations like race and racism with young people and with our elders, if we can approach that with a spirit of love and kindness and generosity and openness, then they make the shift. They make the change. I was talking a little earlier about a story about my mother who used to be a smoker. And she found a note from my nephew where he wrote a class project, and he said that he was concerned that his grandmother might have health issues because of smoking. She found that note. When she found that note, she stopped smoking in that moment. And so I say that to say that was a loving note for her. She understood that he was concerned about her health. And that was enough for her to give up a habit that was not benefiting her. And she was not upset with him for actually writing that note. So, because she knew he came from a loving place. So I think every time we approach anything with love, with our elders and with our young people, we'll get something positive back.
Thank you, Monica. And Vicky, now let's move towards in community and organizations, corporations, in a time where we're so divided here in this country, where it's only going to get worse in the near future. How do we initiate those racial healing conversations? How should we approach them? Walk us through the process.
Yeah, I think that particular question, it impacts and affects every single one of us, especially when we think about the organizations in which we work within, the communities that we come from, sort of the construct that we're managing and mitigating. And there's one sort of example that I want to lift up in this moment, and that's the community of Buffalo. In Buffalo, if you recall, there was a violent mass shooting where communities of color were targeted. Many people lost their lives, many families were impacted, devastating loss of life. And in the community of Buffalo, that is actually one of the communities where we have a truth and racial healing and transformation program through the Buffalo Community Foundation. And that community in particular was, because they had been so immersed in doing racial healing work and addressing systemic racism within Buffalo, they were able to be responsive on the ground and address community issues in the moment because they had been able to do the work. They had built enough relationships across the community where an entire network was able to come together and be responsive to the needs of the families and the individuals that had lost their lives and were murdered. And in that sense, and when I think about a community and an organization that had done the work of racial healing, they were able to turn the tide in some respects and address to the direct impact of what systemic racism looks like, a manifestation of violence that comes from what happens when we dehumanize each other. And in a sense, that sort of an organization had the necessary tools and the capacity to be able to be responsive because they had built the trust and the relationships that were necessary to be able to take care of a community that was in direct need and direct response to racialized violence. And so in that respect, when we talk about what is needed inside organizations, each and every single one of us plays a role inside our organizations and showing up in this kind of work. Each person, every single one of you, is necessary for this kind of change and transformation that is needed. One part of this healing work is about learning how to love ourselves as human beings. Because we live in a world where we're actually walking around, for the most part, unconscious. In some sense, we take in so much of what the system represents, and we're unconscious about that. And we perpetuate it, and we're unconscious about it. And so what do we need to do within ourselves to recognize how the system has impacted each and every single one of us? What do we need to do to heal inside? Because what we bring into an organization is what gets perpetuated in our relationships with each other, how we see each other, how we interact with one another in the workplace, in the community, within our own families. So this is key to why we talk about that relationship development, because that, when we are healthy and whole with ourselves, when we love ourselves, we are then able to love one another. And this gets back to Monica's point around centering love. I know that it sounds meta, right? Love is huge, and it encapsulates a lot. It encompasses so much within ourselves. But as human beings, we have every capacity within ourselves to heal and also to heal each other.
And Reggie, when initiating those conversations, walk me through that process.
Thank you. I think, one of the things that I'd like to ask the group, and you just kind of think about it. If I go back to what I talked about earlier on, about turn to wonder, think about a family member or a colleague that you've probably had an uncomfortable conversation with, or you heard something you weren't comfortable with, and you just kind of walked away from it. Am I right? Can you relate? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, the question would be, what might you do to go back and have that conversation? I believe a couple of things. Number one, we all have choices. And one of the choices that I've made as a healing practitioner is not to step over those moments, but to lean in, and have a conversation with that particular person. I think the other thing is the idea, the belief that people can change, and if they can't change in that moment, they're on their journey too. And as they're on their journey, and if we don't have a conversation with them, where will they end on that journey? And oftentimes, it's just helping them to think a little differently, setting the seed of hope, setting the seed of understanding something from a different perspective. I was holding space for a conversation with the team, and during the conversation, I was processing some recent tragic events in the community with a black young man. And as the team was talking, at one point, one of the black women said, "You know what? Whenever we have these conversations, the only people that speak are the African-American women." And, I don't know, whether you're friend or foe when you're just sitting there listening. And someone in the group, and she said, that makes me uncomfortable. I don't understand that. And at that point, and again, this is a team that had been in relationship, that had been having conversation and building that muscle for deep conversation. And at that point, I think it was a transformative moment where one of the white women said, "You know what? I feel that oftentimes when we're in these conversations, white people are always the ones to speak up first, and oftentimes with the wrong thing." And she said, "So I lay back and figured this is the space for, people that have that experience to speak." And they had a dialogue about why that was not right, why I needed to hear your voice too. Because if I don't hear your conversation, if I don't know what conversation you're going home to have with your children, then I'm feeling I'm just left out here hanging by myself. And then I shut down. they opened up to a beautiful conversation, not just in that moment, but it took the team to another level. And so I do believe that if we can, create the space and hold that space for safe conversation and safety, we can agree to disagree. We can agree to share different perspectives, but it does come with building trust. And I think the follow-up to some of those conversations have to be with permission. And I think what I've always encouraged people is, if Sylvia says to something in the circle or in the conversation that makes me uncomfortable, and I want to follow up, I have to ask Sylvia, can I follow up with you on that conversation we had earlier today? Seeking permission. But I also think it's important for permission to be wrong, because we don't know everything. And as we're learning and we're on our journey, if I at least have the safe space with people that I know, that I can say something and know it might not be right and you're going to help me, that's a powerful moment in itself. And it will help people move along their journey as well. So part of the process, I think, is creating the space, having some agreements with each other, and being able to see the humanity of each other, the solidarity that we're trying to create with each other.
I guess, Monica, we have to go in with no expectations, but maybe with an intention. And if we're having that conversation and some challenges, like Reggie just mentioned, arise, how should we address them? At what moment do you step back?
I think what is beautiful about the racial healing process is that we've learned some tools. And typically, when we have dialogue, it's pretty transactional. And because of these tools, it has given us an opportunity to prepare the space and to be prepared individually for the moment when you don't agree with someone else, or when someone else is having a challenge in the conversation. And so I think, these tools include some of the things that Reggie mentioned, but the other piece of this is that, when Vicky talked about the framework and really understanding the role that racial healing plays in racial equity and moving systems and changing hearts, that's a really important piece to this work, because sometimes as racial healing practitioners, people imagine that racial healing is just for racial healing's sake. And it is sometimes, but in other ways, it's very strategic. We're planning as racial healing practitioners. We do a tremendous amount of planning, and that planning is connected to our outcomes. What are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to move the mark with a policy? Are we trying to move the mark with a system? And once we understand that, we begin to curate the group. We begin to figure out who needs to be in this conversation. We begin to figure out what kind of questions we want to invite them to ask and answer for each other. And how do I prepare as a racial healing practitioner to hold space? Because I know inevitably I might hear something that I don't agree with. And I need to be able to, as I said in the last session, love and disagree at the same time. We can do both. And so that really gives us an opportunity to have some tools to have these conversations. We really have not been taught in any way, whether it was school or in our homes, to build these kind of relationships, and for the purpose of ending racism and to see our common humanity. And so we've got to practice. It's a practice. It's a constant evolution and journey. So the goal is to really find opportunities for us to know what our goal is, create a plan, and bring the right people to the conversation. Some in the choir and some outside of the choir, because that's what's necessary to actually affect change.
For you to achieve transformation.
Yeah.
Rabbi Pesner, as a faith leader, how do you leverage the values and the teachings of your faith to initiate those conversations?
I love the question, and this is why I started with that opening frame, which is the frame we invite our people into. And it's not just for the Jewish community. All faith traditions ought to invite their people in and say, well, if you take these Muslim values seriously, if you take these Christian values seriously, if you take these Hindu values seriously, what does that call us to do? And I'll give you an example, actually, of applying the great wisdom of Monica and the other folks who do racial healing. I get this a lot. You know, Rabbi, you've gone too far. Deep breath, one of my white Jewish family. And I said, really, what have I done this time? And he said, well, we've embraced in our Reformed Jewish movement Juneteenth as a Jewish holiday because we want to create a Jewish frame around Juneteenth that particularly lift up Black Jews and have them see the historical experience inside of Jewish tradition. So we have Black Jews who have written lots of liturgy around Juneteenth to celebrate. And we had a beautiful piece a Black Jewish writer wrote about the connection of Shavuot, which is the Feast of Weeks, and the connections to Juneteenth. It was really beautiful. And he said, I just don't see it. That's just pushing it too far. There's no connection between Shavuot and Juneteenth. So I took a deep breath, and I heard Monica in my head saying, love him. Love him. And I said, person, what? I just want to understand, because Reggie's in my head too, wondering. I wonder, what's the cost to you? How does it hurt you? What are you afraid of?
A lot of times it's fear.
And he couldn't answer. And he actually was quite moved and said, because I created space for sacred honesty, he said, I really don't know. And I said, well, do you think for the person who wrote that, who was the descendant of African slaves, that it gives his Judaism deeper meaning? And I actually think this person moved. So like King said, hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Just like darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. We actually have to live in that space. And to give just can I give another example?
Yes.
So because this gets to Vicky's very agitational comment about policy today. Take another deep breath. My organization's New Jersey state project is in the midst of a desegregation campaign. Anybody from New Jersey? One of the most segregated states in the country. The schools in New Jersey, right? Based on, right? You know what I'm talking about. And so the strategy of this campaign is to get folks in the communities actually talking to each other into an abundance mode out of a scarcity mode. Like, if those schools flourished, it wouldn't come at the expense of these schools. And actually, if we funded equitably across, and we broke down some of the inequity because the cities don't have the funding, but the suburbs do. And by the way, the state constitution makes a demand about quality across. But if we don't just fight the policy fight, if we actually get into the space of love and getting the communities to come together across lines, and one of the strategies is doing this out of the churches and out of the synagogues and out of the mosques, so they come to it out of a place of deep values and faith. And so we say, we as an interfaith, multiracial New Jersey are collectively saying we can all thrive if all of our children thrive. I'm happy to talk to you later about the campaign.
Right now, I work in the news. It's very hard to remain hopeful with everything that's going on. How can we heal when communities are still being wounded? And I want to open it up for all of you.
Can I really appreciate that question, because I'll share a very personal story from my own family. I grew up Native. My mother's Native, and my father was white. And so in the U.S. racial construct, I'm biracial. So my father was of German and Norwegian descent. And at the time that he married my mother, he was disowned from his family for marrying a Native woman. And during that time period, during their era when they married, it was still illegal across many states for interracial marriages. And so my parents were very courageous to fall in love and marry and start a family together. And to this day, I have only met one of my uncles on my father's side and my grandfather before he passed away. And I know very little about my father's side of the family because of that dynamic and the fact that they were afraid of the other. They had a fear of the other. And so they never met me and my brothers and sisters. So I have had to do my own healing work. I have had to understand what it means to look at a picture of my father's side of the family on our fireplace mantle, of seeing blonde, blue-eyed relatives that I don't even know. And I hold out hope, and I have such love for my father's side of the family, even though I have never gotten to know them or understand who they are. I hold out hope that maybe one day, maybe through the work that I'm doing, the legacy that I'm able to leave behind with this kind of work, that maybe someday on my father's side of the family, that they will be able to see me and my mother and my brothers and sisters as human beings. And they will be able to love us like we love them. And I'm hoping that one day that window of opportunity will open so that we're able to be in conversation with each other and to get to know each other because we're family. And so for me, when I think about that divisiveness, I know it's possible to work towards that change and that transformation and to heal our own families, because that divisiveness exists within our own families. So there are ways and practices that can help mend that. And sometimes it will take time. But I still hold on to that hope and love because I know that transformation and change is possible.
I do want to give the audience some opportunity to ask some questions. So Reggie, how do we remain hopeful to close the session?
Yeah. You know, there's a quote I've become very fond of I'd like to share with you as we go into quick Q&A. So when we think about hope, this quote by Bob Johansen really brings these points from his book, The New Leadership Literacies. And here's what he says. Over the next decade, the biggest negative disruptors will be young people who are hopeless and connected. And so much nowadays can be connected through social media. The biggest positive disruptors will be young people who are hopeful and connected. The key variable will be the degree of hope young people experience. Therefore, leaders in the future, us in this room, will be in the seeding hope business, planting seeds of hope, whether we like it or not.
Amen. Monica?
Yes.
Yes, you're hopeful.
Yes, yes. I'm hopeful. I have to be hopeful. You know, I have to believe that we will end racism. If I don't believe that, I can stop doing what I'm doing. There's no point in it. So there is hope. I absolutely have hope.
Rabbi Jonah.
I mean, to be a Jew is to have hope. But I will also add some wisdom out of the African American community. During a particular low point, the last few years obviously has been very challenging, right, everyone? I mean, it's been really hard if you care about racial equity and you care about justice. And I said to Sherilyn Ifill, who's a hero of racial justice, former head of the Legal Defense Fund, at a particularly low moment with kids in cages and an officer-involved shooting and just horrible things happening, I said, Sherilyn, how are we going to get through this? And she looked at me and said, Rabbi, I had ancestors who were born into slavery, and I had ancestors who didn't live to see its end. And I thought, she was teaching the rabbi a lesson, because my whole history is one of confronting oppression and living life, because that's the gift God has given us.
We definitely can do it all together. We have to show up for each other. Solidarity is very important. So I want to thank you so much for inspiring us today. And I want to open the questions for the audiences. Who wants to ask a question? Go ahead.
Hi. So, to your point, how do we disrupt the narrative, right? Because what we seem to be talking about is how bad it is. And so I wonder, how do you lift up the stories where it's going well and where people are making transformational change? And how do we reject the premise as that this is the worst we've ever seen, when I know my grandfather was the youngest son of a man who owned slaves?
Monica, you want to answer?
Yeah, you know, I think we have to, even in my work, I love the idea that I can explore and experiment. One of the things that Black people have not been invited to do is to explore and experiment. So in my business, I decided during COVID that I would open a cafe that would celebrate the life of Dr. George Washington Carver. Dr. Carver's narrative had been reduced to the Peanut Man.
Yeah.
And for me, it was an opportunity for me to design and build an environment that represented the world I want to live in. And so I used business and designing business models as a way for me to expand and change the narrative. So my business is on the corner of 47th and Greenwood on the south side of Chicago. And in the maybe 16 or 17 years that I've been housed there, probably 90% of the people who came into my space were African American. So my goal was to determine if I could intentionally design a space that would be a place of belonging for everyone, that would celebrate Dr. Carver's life. And now I would say, and I'm happy to say, we have a very, very diverse customer base. We have a very, very celebrated conversation around Dr. Carver. People understand now he was a painter. He was, a musician. He was more than the Peanut Man. And so I think we have this opportunity to really define how we want to change the narrative. And it doesn't have to always come through the same vehicles that we're used to, because some of those vehicles are really stuck in these bad systems. And so they're going to keep giving us the narratives that they want us to have. So we have now the opportunity to redefine for ourselves how do we expand this narrative. And it can be in many, many ways.
Ooh, 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 ooh.
Go, Reggie.
Yeah.
And I also think the narrative is being challenged and the narrative is being changed by the younger generation.
Yes.
I think intergenerationally, if we can get engaged in conversation, I love the fact we see young people in the room.
Yes.
Because they're not standing by just watching.
Yes.
And through our fellowship programs, the conversations we're having with different programs, the faces in the room, it's being changed, and sometimes I think it's a challenge of, keeping up with it. So.
Silvia?
I'm from El Paso, Texas, where we had a horrifying shooting. And at the time, I was leading a nonprofit organization, and we created what we called the Community Conversation for Healing, because, and we didn't know what to expect. We didn't know how many people would show up. We had over 400 people just come in and sit and talk about what happened, how they felt in that moment, because one of the things that happened at Walmart, it wasn't just Hispanics that were murdered. We had African Americans, we had Jewish. It affected every single group. And then they came for me, is that kind of the feeling that we had around there. So when we decided to have this community healing, and it was incredibly powerful, we partnered with our Black community. We partnered with our Jewish community. We didn't forget our Native American community. And we all came together to talk about how the pain felt. But then we came across that bridge to decide what were the things that we needed to think about. And you know what we came to is love. It's forgiveness, partnership, and working together. So when you talk about healing, and this session has just been so invigorating to my soul, I just want to say that to you, because coming from a community where there was so much pain, and the pain that I'm sure many others have felt here as well, knowing that there is a space for racial healing, for healing against violence. And it's something we can't depend on others to do, because if we had sat there and waited for somebody else to decide that there was going to be a conversation of healing, we might still be waiting. But when we partnered with our friends, with our rabbis, with our pastors, and said, we have to create that in ourselves, that's where healing came. So my question for you is, how are you partnering with other groups to try to bring this racial healing, this community healing together?
Rabbi Pesner, you want to?
I can't be more articulate than Sylvia just was. I mean, and I'm so moved. I know the Rabbi of El Paso. I know the synagogue. I mean, this is what it is. It happened in Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh. It was Uvalde. God help us, the children, right? It's in Buffalo, and it is this, and I'm gonna say it, the great replacement lie, right? It is this idea that there is a global campaign organized by Jews to turn America black, brown, and Muslim through immigration policy and elections, okay? It is a lie, it is not a conspiracy theory. And it is on all of us to reclaim what is the hope of American democracy and actually be both in loving solidarity and healing on a local level, and then build the multiracial inclusive democracy so that we can actually protect everybody and have everybody thrive. But this is a great example of what it actually looks like.